At 21, Zora buried the grandfather who raised her. Her two brothers did not wait for the headstone. They took the money and the house. They sold the foundry he had run since before they were born, the one that made a cast-iron stove people waited years to buy, and it went whole for $2.6 million. What Zora got was one line at the bottom of the will: 40 acres on the mountain, assessed at $11,000, with a shack on it that nobody had walked into in years. Her brothers laughed about it right there at the lawyer's table. But their grandfather had driven up that mountain every weekend for 50 years, and in all that time he never once came back with a fish. The reading happened on a Tuesday in the third week of April, in a conference room in the county seat that smelled like carpet glue and burnt coffee. There were 9 chairs around the table and only 5 people in the room. Somebody had set out a plate of shortbread cookies still in the plastic tray. Zora sat at the end with her hands in her lap. She had a callus on the pad of her left thumb, hard as a dime, and she rubbed it with her forefinger without knowing she was doing it. She'd been doing that since she was 16. Adele Nunez had drafted the will back when Zora was 10, when it still meant something, and she read it out loud, because that was the job. She was a small woman who held her reading glasses a few inches off the page instead of wearing them. Across the table, Garrett had his phone face down and his hand flat on top of it. He was 33, and he had gotten heavy in the last year, the year he stopped sleeping. Beside him sat a lawyer he had hired himself, a man from out of town in a good jacket who had not said anything yet. Nolan sat one chair down from his brother with his elbows on his knees, looking at the carpet. "To my grandson Garrett," Adele read, "and to my grandson Nolan, and to my granddaughter Zora in equal shares the residue of my estate." She stopped. She lowered the page and looked at the 3 of them over the top of it. "There isn't a residue," she said. Garrett's lawyer spoke for the first time. "There's a checking account." "There's a checking account with 4,000 and change in it," Adele said. "Which is the estate. That's the whole estate. Everything else was moved into the company 18 months ago while your grandfather was in a hospital bed, unable to say his own name. Moved lawfully," the lawyer said. "I didn't say otherwise." Nolan did not look up. Zora watched the top of his head and waited for him to look up. And he didn't. And after a while, she stopped waiting. Adele went back to the page. "There's one more item. It's a specific bequest. It predates everything else and it wasn't touched because nobody thought to touch it." She read it flatly, the way you read a serial number. "To my granddaughter Zora, the 40 acres on Bittern Creek and everything standing on it." The room was quiet for a second. Then Garrett laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, which somehow made it worse. It was the laugh of a man hearing a punchline he had already guessed. "The shack," he said. 40 acres, Adele said. 40 acres of rock, Adele. There's no road, no power, no septic. He turned to his lawyer, still smiling, wanting the smile matched. "What's the county say it's worth?" The lawyer already had it. He had it because he had prepared it, which meant somebody had asked him to prepare it. "Assessed at 11,000, he said. "Give or take, rounding error." "Rounding error," Garrett repeated, and he said it kindly to Zora, like he was letting her off a hook. "Look, Zor, when this all shakes out, you'll get taken care of, you know that." "Sure," Zora said. It was the only thing she said in that room. She had come in with about 9 things she wanted to say, and she left with all 9 of them still in her mouth. Out in the parking lot, the sky had gone the color of dishwater, and it had started doing that thing that isn't rain yet. Zora got into her truck. It was a green quarter-ton, with a water pump dying since February, and it took 3 tries to catch. She sat with her hands on the wheel and watched her brothers walk to Garrett's car together. Garrett said something. Nolan laughed. They got in and drove out, and neither of them looked at the green truck at all, and that was the part that got her. More than the $11,000, more than the shack. They just didn't look. You have to know what the 3 of them were to each other before. Their parents died when Zora was 6. It was a wreck on a wet road in November, both of them at once, and there was no long illness, and no goodbye and no time to arrange anything. Zora does not remember them. She has been told she does, but what she has are photographs she has looked at so many times that the looking has replaced the remembering. Emil Kovac was 64 when he became a father again. This was his second time. He had buried his wife at 29 and raised their son by himself. And then, that son grew up and married and had 3 children and drove into a guardrail, and Emil got the whole thing handed back to him with the paperwork still warm. He did not complain. Zora has thought about that a great deal since, and where she keeps landing is that he never complained to anybody, ever, and that this was probably the most damaging thing about him. He raised them in the house on the hill above the works. Garrett was 18 and already halfway gone. Nolan was 13 and furious. Zora was 6 and small enough to be carried, and she got carried long after she should have been walking, and she has never once apologized for that. The foundry was called Kovac Stove Works. Emil's father started it after the war, in a low brick building with a cupola furnace and 11 men. Emil took it over at 19 when his father dropped dead on the sand floor, and he ran it for 6 decades and never grew it, and never sold it, and never once made anything else. It made one product, a cast iron wood stove, plate steel and gray iron, about the size of a large dog. It weighed 400 pounds, and you could not lift one end of it by yourself and it would outlive you. He named it the Zora in the 3rd year after he buried his wife. 26 winters later, when his son's youngest was born, he asked if they would name her the same. They did. So the stove was 26 years older than the girl who shared its name, and both of them were named for a woman who had been dead half a century, and Emil never explained any of this to anyone because he did not believe explanations were owed. People waited a long time for one. There was a list. The list was a spiral notebook in the office, with names going back to when Zora was in middle school, and every so often a name came up and a woman in shipping would call, and the person on the other end would usually cry. The buyer's people loved the name. That was in the deck. Zora saw the deck once, over Garrett's shoulder, before she knew what she was looking at. There was a slide with the stove on it, and the word Zora in a font that was not the font, and underneath it, in smaller letters, a line about Heritage Brand Equity testing well in the target demographic. They sold a stove with her name on it, and not one of them thought of her while they signed. She started on the pattern bench at 16. It happened by accident, or it looked like an accident at the time. She had come down to the works after school because there was nowhere else to be, and Emil was at the bench with a piece of sugar maple in the vise, and he did not turn around. He just held a gouge out behind him with 2 fingers, handle first, and waited. She took it because he was not going to stand there forever. "Push," he said. Where you want it to go." That was the whole lesson. That was close to the whole lesson for the rest of his life, because Emil Kovac was not a teacher and had no interest in becoming one. He would stand at her shoulder and watch and say nothing for 40 minutes, then reach past her and turn the wood 2 degrees and walk away. She understood something at 16 that she could not have said out loud for a long time. Nobody else came down. Garrett was in the office running numbers he did not like. Nolan was on the floor when he felt like it, and at the bar when he didn't. She was the one who came down every day from 16 to 21, and it was not because she was noble. It was quiet down there, and the old man never asked her how she was doing. By 19, she could carve a stove door. By 20, she could carve a stove door the melter could not tell from her grandfather's, and the melter had been there since before she was born. The stroke came in the fall, a year and a half before the end. It took his speech and left his hands. Nobody could explain to her why it worked out that way, and she asked 3 different doctors. The words were gone, and the hands were fine. He could still hold a gouge, still put an edge on it. What he could not do was tell her what he was making with it. There was one word left: door. He had it from the first week, and he had it until the last day, and he said it constantly. He said it to the nurse, to the ceiling, to Ruben Ochoa, who came by after shift most nights and sat with him and did not need him to talk. Sometimes he said it to Zora while she was cutting his food up. He would get her wrist and hold it and look right at her and say it, and his eyes were completely clear. And there was somebody in there. She would say, "I know, Grandpa," which meant nothing, which was a lie, which she said maybe 400 times. Garrett found it maddening. That is his word, not hers. She heard him use it on the phone in the hallway. He says one word, Garrett said to whoever it was. One, over and over. It's like a smoke alarm. And then Garrett would go in and close the door because he thought that was what the old man wanted. The letter came 9 days after the reading. It was on the new letterhead, and it was 2 paragraphs long and warm. It thanked her for her contributions. As part of an operational review, the letter explained the pattern department was being restructured, and her position would not continue in its current form. They hoped she would stay in touch. The pattern department was 1 bench and 1 person, and the person was her. Reuben got his the same week. 31 years on the sand floor, and he was 3 months short of the day his pension vested, and somebody in a spreadsheet somewhere had noticed that, because it is not the kind of thing you miss by accident. Zora drove down to the works that night. Her badge still worked, which she took to mean nobody had gotten to that line item yet. The floor was dark and the cupola was cold, and the building made no sound at all, and if you grow up in a foundry, that is the loudest thing you will ever hear. She went to her bench. They had already cleared it. Her gouges were in a milk crate on the floor with the edges touching each other, which no one who had ever held one would do. The bench itself was worn into a shallow dish in the middle from 6 decades of a man leaning his forearms in the same place, and she put her hands in the dish and stood there a while. The apron was still on the hook by the door. Canvas, brown, stiff as a shingle, with a burn scar across the belly from something that happened before she was born. She was reaching for it when the lights came on. Zor. Garrett was in the doorway with his keys in his hand. He looked tired, and he looked like he had been crying at some point in the last few days, which she noticed and filed away and did not use. Badge still works, she said. Yeah, I'll get that. He came in a few steps. He looked at the crate on the floor and then away from it. You shouldn't be down here. I worked here yesterday. You know what I mean. She did know what he meant. She waited to see if he was going to say the other thing, the real thing, and he almost did. It came up in him and got about as far as his throat. What he said was, "It's not personal. It's a foundry," Zora said. "It's all personal. It's 400 pounds and somebody's name is on it." Garrett rubbed his face with his free hand. "Take the tools," he said. "Nobody wants the tools." She picked up the crate. It was heavy and it dug into her hip, and she got it up onto her shoulder, and she got to the doorway and she stopped because Garrett had taken the apron off the hook. He had it folded over his arm, and he was not looking at her. He was looking at it. "That's his," Zora said. "I know whose it is. Garrett." "It's company property," he said, and it was such a stupid thing to say that neither of them could look at each other afterward. He carried it out to his car. She heard the trunk. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with a milk crate of gouges on the seat beside her, and her forehead on the steering wheel. Here is where she was. She had $1,900 and some in an account she had opened at 14 with birthday money. The truck had a water pump that would not survive the summer. There was a milk crate on the seat, and there was no job in a town with one employer, and the one employer had just fired her by letter, and the letter had been signed by a man whose diapers her grandfather had changed. The house on the hill sold in 11 days. She had a bed in it, and a dresser and a window that looked down at the works. A stranger's realtor put a lockbox on the door, and Zora took her things out in 4 trips because that was all there was. Then she slept 2 nights in the truck behind the laundromat. Nobody bothered her. This is a small town, and everybody knew whose truck it was and why it was there, and not one person knocked on the window, and she has decided since that they were being kind, and she is probably right. On the 3rd day, she drove up the mountain because it was the only piece of the earth with her name attached to it. The turnoff is 9 miles out of town, and there is no sign. There is a gap in the trees where a gap does not belong, and then 2 ruts going up, and the ruts are not a road. The county has never maintained it and does not know it exists. It took her 40 minutes to go 1.5 miles. The truck bottomed out twice. There was a fallen larch across the ruts at the halfway point, and she got out and moved it, and it moved easier than it should have, and she noticed that and did not think about it. Then the ruts turned and the trees opened, and there it was. She had been expecting a shack. Garrett had said shack, Everybody had always said shack, for as long as she could remember. On the rare occasions anybody said anything at all. It was small, that much was true. It was one story, built of squared logs gone silver with a metal roof. The roof was new. She stood in the ruts with the engine ticking behind her and looked at it, and something in the back of her neck went cold, because that roof had gone up maybe 6 winters ago, and it had been put on by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing, and her grandfather had not been able to climb a ladder since she was in high school. The door was oak and swollen in the frame. There was no lock on it. There had never been a lock on it. She put her shoulder into it twice, and on the second one, it went. The smell hit her first, and she knew it before she knew it. Linseed oil and wood shavings, and iron. It was the exact smell of the 2 feet of air around her grandfather for her entire life. She stood in the doorway with her hand still on the wood. It was not a shack. It was a shop. A bench ran the whole south wall under 3 windows, worn into a dish in the middle, the same dish, the same forearms. Above it hung 30 or 40 gouges on a rack, arranged in order of sweep, and every single edge was bright. In the corner sat a hand-cranked lathe. Under a tarp, a stack of sugar maple went back 6 feet, air-dried and stickered properly. On the bench was a coffee cup, washed sitting upside down on a folded towel, and above the door where you would see it walking out and not walking in, hung a clock. It was a wind-up, an old brass, one on a nail. Zora stood in her dead grandfather's doorway with the cold coming in behind her, and watched the second hand come around and around and around. It was running. She did not touch it. She stood in the doorway and got her phone out and held it up next to the clock face and compared them, and the clock was fast by about 1.5 minutes, which is what a wind-up does if you leave it alone for a week. A week. Not a decade. A week. "Hello," she said, to a room with nobody in it. Nothing came back. She said it again anyway, louder, and then she went through the whole building in about 90 seconds, because there was only the one room and a loft over the north end with a ladder bolted to the wall. There was no bed. That was the first thing she noticed that mattered. Nobody was living here. There was no cot, no bedroll, no clothes on a nail, no food. A man had not been hiding up here. A man had been working up here. She started at the bench because the bench is where she starts. It ran the whole south wall, sugar maple, 3 inches thick, and somebody had built it out of one slab, which she knew because she went looking for the seam and there wasn't one. The dish in the middle was maybe 1/4 inch deep. It takes a long time to wear 1/4 inch into maple with your forearms. The gouges were the thing that stopped her. There were 38 of them on the rack. She counted, because counting gave her something to do while her hands shook. They were hung in order of sweep, 1 through 9, and inside each sweep they went left to right by width. And that was exactly how the rack at the works was laid out, because she had laid it out that way at 17, and Emile had watched her do it and said nothing, and she had thought at the time she was inventing something. She took one down, a number 3, 1/2 inch, and the edge caught the light in one continuous line with no dull spot anywhere along it. Somebody had stropped it. Recently, you could tell because a stropped edge has a mirror on the bevel, and a mirror does not survive 6 months of a cold room in the mountains. It fogs. It gets a haze on it. This had no haze. She put it back in its slot and stood there with her hand over her mouth. The stove in the corner was a Zora. Of course it was. She went and crouched in front of it and opened the door, and there was a bed of clean ash in the bottom, and she put 2 fingers in it, and it was cold, but it was fine ash. Screened ash, ash from a fire that somebody had let burn all the way down instead of smothering it. The cereal is on the back leg. They always are. She had to lie on the floor with her phone light to read it. It was 004. Number 4. He cast the first 3 in the spring the stove got its name, and they went to the bank in the church, and the man who lent him the money for the sand, and everybody in town has always known that. Number 4 was the one nobody could account for. It was a story people told, sort of in the way a town tells a story it does not really care about. Old Emile kept one back. Nobody ever asked where he put it. He put it here. He had been sitting in front of it 1/2 century in a room nobody knew about, warming his hands on the first thing he ever made that was his. The ladder went up to the loft, and she went up it. Here is what you need to know, and it takes about a minute, and then everything else makes sense. You do not carve a stove. You carve a shape of the stove, out of wood, and the shape is called a pattern. Press that pattern down into damp sand, packed in a box, then pull it out, and now there is a hole in the sand that is the exact shape of a stove door. Then you pour iron into the hole. The iron does not know anything. The iron does what the sand tells it, and the sand does what the wood tells it. So every Kovach stove that ever came out of that building, every one on every porch in 4 counties, was the wood. All of it, all the way back. And wood moves. It swells, it shrinks, it dents, it takes a knock from a molder's elbow at 4 in the afternoon on a Friday, so the patterns wear. You repair them, you fill and shim and build them back up. And every repair puts you 1/1000th of an inch further from where you started. And after enough of them, the door does not sit in the frame the way it used to, and the stove leaks smoke into somebody's living room in the 3rd winter, and they say Kovach isn't what it was. Zora had been repairing the works pattern since she was 18. She had filled the door pattern herself, twice. She knew every scar on it because she had put half of them there. Then she got her head over the top of the ladder and stopped. The loft ran the whole north end, and it was dry and it was full. There were pegs in the rafters, rows of them, and hanging off the pegs were patterns. Hundreds. She did not count these because there was no counting them. They hung in the dark, going back into the eaves, and every one of them had a tag on it in her grandfather's handwriting, which she would have known anywhere on earth, because he wrote his 7s with a bar through them, and nobody else in this country does that. She crawled up and knelt on the floorboards, and just looked for a while. Then she found the door. It was on the 2nd peg from the ladder, at the front, where you would put the thing you reach for most. She lifted it off with both hands and turned it over. She had been holding the same shape since she was 16, and this was not the same shape. There was no fill in it. There was no shim, no epoxy, no built-up corner where somebody dropped it in 1991. The lettering around the rim was cut, not cast and recut and cast again. It was cut by a hand, once, correctly, and it had never been fixed because it had never been broken, because it had never been on a foundry floor in its life. Her thumb went around the inside of the flange and found the draft angle, that little slope you put on a pattern so it will pull out of the sand clean, and it was perfect, and the one at the works was not perfect, and she had spent 2 summers assuming that was just what the tool felt like. She sat down on the floor of the loft with a piece of maple in her lap and understood the whole thing at once. The ones at the works were copies, all of them. Every pattern she had ever touched, every shape she had ever repaired, was a copy of something hanging in this room. These were the originals. These were the masters. Her grandfather had spent his life keeping the true shape of the thing 9 miles up a mountain on 40 acres of rock that the county said was worth $11,000. And last Tuesday, her brothers had signed it over to her at a table with cookies on it and laughed. They took the money, the house, and the business. They forgot the shapes. She was still sitting there when the headlights came up through the trees. She heard the truck before she saw it. Low gear, taking the ruts slow, and she came down that ladder faster than was smart and got to the door and picked up a splitting maul that was leaning by the frame, because she was 21 and alone and 9 miles from anything. The truck stopped. The engine went off. A door opened and shut. "It's Reuben," a voice said from behind the headlights. "Put down whatever you picked up." She did not put it down. Reuben Ochoa came around into the light with both hands out to the sides. Not high, just out. The posture of a man who has spent his whole life around people holding heavy objects. He was 68, and he had a gray mustache, and his coat was the same coat he had worn to work every day of Zora's life. "How did you know I was here?" she said. "Because I've been coming up here every Saturday for a year and a half," he said. "And there's a truck in my spot." They stood there. "Zora," he said, "put down the maul. Please. I'm too old for this." She put down the maul. He came the rest of the way and stopped at the porch and looked past her into the room, and she watched his face do something complicated. "You got the door open?" he said. "I put my shoulder in it. He never fixed that door. 50 winters he never planed it. I asked him about it twice. Reuben shook his head slowly. You know what he said? He said, if it's hard to get in, only the ones who mean it get in. Zora's throat closed up so fast it surprised her. Come inside, Reuben said. It's cold, and I've got about an hour of talking to do, and I'd rather do it sitting. He got the fire going in number 4 without being told where anything was, which told her more than anything he said that night. He knew where the kindling was. The damper was stiff, and you had to lift it and push, and he lifted it and pushed, all of it with his back to her and his hands working from memory. Start at the beginning, Zora said. The beginning's before my time and I wasn't there. Then start at yours. Reuben sat down on an upturned crate. He put his hands on his knees. After the stroke, they took his license, he said. 3rd day out of the hospital. Garrett did it, and I'm not going to sit here and say Garrett was wrong to do it, because he wasn't. The man couldn't say a sentence. You don't drive. Okay, so that Saturday I come by the house to sit with him like I do, and he's got his coat on. Standing in the front hall with his coat on and his boots on and the keys in his hand, and the keys don't go to anything anymore. Reuben looked at the fire, and he holds them out to me. Zora sat down on the floor. She did not decide to. I drove him up, Reuben said. That Saturday, and the one after that, and every one after that until the week he died. 90-some Saturdays. I'd get him up that ladder, which was a whole production by the end. And he'd work 3-4 hours, and I'd sit down here and do the crossword and pretend I wasn't listening for him to fall. He was working. He was working. Reuben. Her voice came out wrong. He couldn't talk. He couldn't talk to you, Reuben said. He carved fine. Carving isn't talking. It's the other side of the brain or something. I don't know the words for it. The doctors had words for it. He rubbed his mustache. He'd get up there, and his hands knew right where they were going. Came down some Saturdays looking 2 decades younger and couldn't tell me one thing about it. And you never said anything. To me, it came out harder than she meant it to, and she let it stay hard. Reuben took it. He did not flinch, and he did not defend himself, and he sat with it, which she would think about later. No, he said. I didn't. Why? Because he asked me not to. How? She was almost shouting. How did he ask you anything? He had one word. He had one word, and he had 2 hands, and he had a face. Reuben said quietly, You think I didn't know what he wanted? I knew him since before you were born. First week I drove him up here. I said, Emil, does Zora know about this place? And he went like this. Reuben put a finger to his lips. Zora looked at the floor for a long moment. He was going to tell you, Reuben said, that I'd bet my house on. He had something up there he was working on, and it wasn't done, and he wanted it done first. That's the whole man. That's him from the ground up. He wouldn't show you a thing until it was finished. He shrugged, and the shrug had a lifetime of tiredness in it. And then he didn't finish it. And then he died. He should have told me. Yes, Reuben said. He should have. That surprised her. She had braced for a defense and got agreement instead, and it took the legs out from under something she had been standing on. He didn't hide it from you, Reuben said. He just never thought you'd want it. That's worse. I know it is. The fire popped. Number 4 was drawing beautifully, which after half a century it had every right to. There's something you need to explain to me, Zora said. The patterns upstairs. Ah, Reuben said. They're the originals. They are. Reuben, I've been repairing copies. Since I was 16, I've been repairing copies of something that's been hanging in a loft 9 miles away, and nobody told me. Nobody told anybody, Reuben said. That's the part you're not getting yet. Sit down, I'm going to tell you the strangest thing about your grandfather, and it is going to make you angry. She sat. Every so often, Reuben said, a pattern would show up on the bench Monday morning. What do you mean, show up? I mean, it would be there. New one. Cut fresh. Nobody carried it in. Nobody said a word about it. It was just on the bench, and the old one was gone. He held his hands out. First time I saw it happen, I was 29. I said to the melter, Hey, where'd the new door come from? And he looked at me like I'd asked him where the rain comes from. And nobody ever asked. Not one time. Not in 3 decades. Reuben's mouth went flat. That's what I keep chewing on. Not that he hid it, that we let him. Every Monday for half a century, a shape appeared out of nowhere and made all our work possible, and not one of us ever turned around and said, "Hey, where's this coming from?" "Somebody's making them. Somebody's making them," Reuben agreed. "Somebody's been making them since before I was born, and last month, somebody stopped." Zora looked at the ladder. She thought about a loft full of pegs going back into the dark under the eaves, and a man going up there 90-some Saturdays with one word in his mouth. "So what happens now?" she said. Reuben did not answer right away. He leaned forward and opened the stove door and put another split on, and he took his time about it. And when he sat back up, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. And Reuben Ochoa had been in her life since the day she was born. He looked almost sorry for them. "What happens now," he said, "is that in about 6 months, everything that comes out of that building is going to start coming out wrong. Wrong how? Doors that don't seat, tops that rock, seams you can see daylight through." He counted them off on his fingers without any pleasure in it at all. "The set down there is worn to the edge of tolerance right now, today. It's been running on the last pattern he brought down, and that was 2 summers ago. It'll hold through the summer. Come fall, it starts going. They can fix them." "With what?" Reuben said. "Fix them off of what? You fix a pattern off the master. That's what a master is for. That's the whole reason it exists." Zora's mouth was dry. "Your brothers sold a foundry," Reuben said. "They sold the building, and the sand, and the name, and the list of people waiting. They sold every single thing in that place, except the one thing that makes it worth anything, because that thing is hanging in a loft on 40 acres they thought was worth $11,000, and they gave it to you." He put his hands back on his knees, and in about 6 months, he said everything they pour is going to start coming out wrong, and they are going to have absolutely no idea why. Reuben left around midnight. He did not offer her his couch, and she has always been grateful for that. He put his coat on, and at the door he stopped and said, "There's a spring 40 feet behind the woodshed. It runs all year. He drank out of it his whole life, and it never killed him. Then he was gone, and the sound of his truck went down the mountain a long way before it stopped being a sound." She slept on the floor in front of number 4 with her coat over her. She slept 14 hours. When she woke up, it was afternoon, and the fire was out, and she did not know where she was for about 4 seconds, and then she did, and she lay there and looked at the underside of the bench. The next 3 days, she did nothing. This is the part people leave out. She had just found the thing, and the correct response was to leap up and get to work, and what she actually did was lie on the floor of a cold cabin for 3 days and stare at a ceiling. There were crackers, and she ate them out of the box. She drank the spring water, and it was so cold it hurt her teeth. Once she got up and walked to the ladder and put her hand on the 3rd rung, and stood there for a while and then went back and lay down. Grief is not a montage. She was 21, and everyone who had ever been responsible for her was dead or had signed a paper, and she was on a mountain, and there was nobody to perform recovery for. On the 4th day, she picked up a gouge. She did not plan to. She got up to find the crackers, and her hand went past the rack and took a number 5 down without asking her, and then she was standing at the bench with a piece of scrap in the vise, and she pushed. Her hands remembered. That was the thing that broke her. Finally, on day 4, with a gouge in her fist. Her hands remembered, and her hands did not care about any of it. They did not care about the will or the letterhead or the man in the good jacket. They knew where they were going, and they went, and the shaving came off the maple in one long curl and dropped on her boot. She cried standing up, working, and did not stop working, and that is the only time in this story you will hear about it. The notebooks were under the bench. There was a shelf down there she had walked past 100 times, and on it were ledgers, the green kind with the cloth spine, and there were 51 of them. She counted these. Counting was still helping. She pulled one at random and opened it, and it was a heat log. Every pour he ever made, every single one. Date, and then the weather, and then the sand moisture, and then the charge, which is what you put in the furnace, so many pounds of pig iron and so much scrap, and a fistful of ferrosilicon. And then the tap temperature, and then what came out the other end and what was wrong with it. The weather. He wrote down the weather. She sat on the floor with the book open on her knees and could not figure out why for a solid minute. And then she got it, and when she got it, she said a word out loud that her grandfather would not have liked. Sand moisture moves with the humidity. Wet air, wetter sand, more steam when the iron hits it, and steam under a casting is what gives you a pinhole in the door of somebody's stove in the third winter. So he wrote down the weather for 6 decades, and he adjusted, and nobody at that foundry ever knew he was doing it, because he never said. There was no recipe on any wall at the works. There was no binder. She had asked him once, at 19, how he knew how much ferrosilicon, and he had looked at the ladle and said, "You look at it." He was not being cryptic. He was being 51 green notebooks that nobody had ever asked to see. She closed the ledger. He wasn't fishing. She said out loud, to the room, to nobody. He was working the entire time, and we let him do it alone. Reuben came up that Saturday, because it was Saturday. He did not knock. He came in with 2 grocery bags and set them on the bench and started putting things away in a cupboard she had not opened yet. And it turned out there were plates in there. "You look better," he said. "I look terrible." "You look better than Tuesday." He folded the bags flat, because he is a man who folds bags flat. "There's coffee. There's real food. You can't live on crackers, I saw the box." He did not ask how she was. He did not say a single thing about her brothers, or the works, or the future. Groceries went in the cupboard, and then he sat down on his crate and did the crossword for 2 hours while she worked at the bench. And when he left, he took the trash with him. The melter came the Saturday after that. Zora heard the truck and got that same jolt in her chest and came out onto the porch. And it was the melter, who had run the cupola for 26 of the 54 he had been on this earth and had a burn scar on his forearm in the shape of Ohio. "Reuben says you got a lathe up here that don't turn," he said. "It turns. It's just stiff. That's what don't turn means." He got a toolbox out of the bed of his truck. Nobody invited any of them. That is the part she could never explain right afterward, when people asked. Nobody organized it. Nobody made a phone call that she knows of. And there was never a moment where anyone said the words, "We are going to help you." They just came up the mountain on Saturdays because the works was shut and their hands had nowhere to be. The woman who ran the crane came in June and brought a chainsaw and cut the fallen larch out of the ruts, the one Zora had been driving around for 6 weeks, and then she widened the turn at the bottom by about 4 feet, and then she went home. By July, there were sometimes 5 people up there on a Saturday, and no plan whatsoever. She told Reuben about the school on a Thursday, which was not a Saturday, which meant he had come up on his own for no reason at all. She was stropping a gouge. He was watching her do it, which he did sometimes, standing at her shoulder without comment, and she understood exactly where he had learned that. "I got into a program," she said. Metal arts, out west, when I was 18. She kept the bevel flat on the leather and pushed away from the edge, back and forth. 2-year thing. They took 11 people. I was one of the 11. Reuben did not say anything. "I never told anybody," she said. "Not Garrett, not Nolan, not him." She turned the gouge over. The letter came in August, and the stroke was in October, and by November I had a job feeding a man applesauce. So you didn't go." "I didn't go." Reuben was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You want me to tell you that you did the right thing?" "No." "Good," he said, "because I wasn't going to. That's not mine to hand out." He picked up a scrap of maple and turned it over in his fingers. "I'll tell you a different thing. That old man had 2 hands and 1 word, and he made 90-some trips up this mountain with them. He didn't do that for a girl who couldn't hack it out west." She stopped stropping. "Whatever you think you gave up," Reuben said, "he was counting on you being the one who stayed. That's not a consolation prize, Zora. He built the whole last stretch of his life on it." She changed the subject. She asked him about the crane woman's chainsaw, and he let her change the subject. And that was Thursday. The cloth had been on the bench the entire time. That is the thing she cannot get over. Still, it was there the first night. It was there when Reuben lit the fire, and it was there through the 3 days on the floor, and the fourth day with the gouge, and every Saturday since. And it was just a shop cloth, gray, folded over something at the far end of the bench, and she had assumed it was covering nothing. A vise, a grinder, some tool. You do not look under a cloth in a dead man's shop. You just don't. She could not tell you why. In the last week of July, she was chasing a chisel that had rolled, and she put her hand on the cloth to steady herself, and she felt the shape underneath, and the shape was wrong. She stood up. She pulled the cloth off. It was a stove. It was a pattern for a stove in sugar maple, and it was small, 18 inches across maybe. It would not heat a house. It would not heat 2 rooms. What it would heat was 1 room, 1 small room, 1 room about the size of the room she was standing in. And it was finished. The body, the top, the legs, the flue collar, all of it cut and sanded and sealed with shellac, the way you seal a pattern you intend to use, and the draft angles were on it, and it was ready. It was ready to go into sand tomorrow. There was no door. The opening was there. The frame for the door was there, cut clean, waiting. And the door itself was not on the bench, and it was not on any peg in that loft. And she went up and looked, and it was not there, because it had never been made. If you have made it this far into Zora's story, take a second and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She turned it over. She was looking for a tag, because everything in that building had a tag, and there was no tag. What there was, on the underside of the base, in pencil in a hand she had known her whole life, with the 7s barred, was this: for Z, when she has a place of her own. Zora sat down on the crate. Her first thought, and she has never told anyone this except Reuben, was that it was for her grandmother. That is where her head went, immediately, without a fight. Of course it was for her grandmother. Everything was for her grandmother. The stove downstairs was named for her. The girl standing in this room was named for her. The whole cabin was built the year she died. A little stove for a woman who never got a place of her own. She sat with that for a minute, and it was sad, and it was tidy, and it was wrong. Because in the corner of the base, under the pencil, was a date. It was 5 summers old. Her grandmother had been dead for half a century when that date was written. There was no version of the world in which a man carved a stove in his 70s for a wife he buried at 29 and wrote a date on it like a work order. Zora looked at the date for a long time. She was 16 that year. 16, and that was the year he held a gouge out behind him with 2 fingers, handle first, and did not turn around, and waited to see if she would take it. She took it, and that spring, or that summer, some Saturday she was not told about, a man drove 9 miles up a mountain and started cutting a stove for the girl who took it. Not for the day she left. For the day she had a place of her own. Zora put the pattern down on the bench very carefully, like it might go off. Then she went outside and stood in the yard for a while with her hands on top of her head, breathing in a clearing at 8 in the evening in July, and the light was coming sideways through the trees, and she was 21. And she had just found out she had been loved on purpose, in advance, for 5 summers, by a man who could not say her name. Reuben found her out there an hour later when he came up with a headlight out on his truck. "You okay?" "He was making me a stove," she said. Reuben looked at her. Then he looked past her at the open door of the cabin, at the bench, at the gray cloth on the floor where she had dropped it. "Ah," he said. "So that's what that was. You knew. I knew he was working on something. I didn't know what. I never went up that ladder. That was his." He rubbed his mustache. 90-some Saturdays, Zora. He wasn't up here restoring old junk. He was up here making you a thing. It's not done. No, there's no door. I heard him say so about 400 times. And Zora had to sit down in the dirt of the yard. That was the last week of July. Grandpa spent his whole life making things that outlast the people who buy them, and it took her until the last week of July, sitting in the dirt, to think of asking what he had been making that would outlast him. The black car came on the 9th of August. She heard it wrong at first. It did not sound like Reuben's truck, or the melter's truck, or anything that belonged up there. It sounded expensive, and it sounded like it was in pain, and it was, Because it was a low black sedan, and it was coming up a road that eats low black sedans. The car stopped in the yard at an angle. There was a rental sticker in the window, and a strip of undercarriage trim hanging off the back of it. Dragging. A man got out. He was maybe 40, and he had a soft jacket and good boots that had never done anything. And he looked up at the cabin, and then at the loft window with an expression she did not like at all, because it was not curiosity. He was checking something against something. "Miss Kovac," he said. "Colin Reyes." She did not answer. She had a chisel in her hand and she did not put it down. "I've been trying to reach you." He came around the car, careful with his footing. "There's no service up here. There's no address up here. Do you know they don't have this road in the system? I had to get a map from 1961. Who are you?" "I'm with the group that bought your grandfather's company," he said pleasantly. And then he did the thing that stopped her heart. He reached into his jacket and took out a photograph and held it up so she could see it, and he was not threatening her with it. There was no threat in it at all. He was showing her something he assumed they both already knew about. It was the loft, taken from the top of the ladder, pegs going back into the eaves, hundreds of shapes hanging in the dark, and her grandfather's tags on every one. "I'd like to talk to you about what's upstairs," Colin Reyes said. Zora looked at the photograph. She had been up that ladder maybe 200 times since April, and she had never taken a picture of it, and neither had Ruben, and Emil Kovac had never owned a phone that could. Somebody else had stood up there. Somebody had climbed her grandfather's ladder in her grandfather's cabin and held up a phone and taken that picture. And there was exactly one person alive who had ever been up here as a kid and would have remembered a loft full of wooden shapes. "Who took that?" Zora said. "I'm not going to answer that." Colin Reyes said it without any edge at all, which somehow made it worse. "Not because I'm protecting anybody. It's just not going to help you, and it's not mine to give away. You're standing in my yard." "I am." He looked around the clearing, at the woodshed, at the truck with the bad water pump. "Can we go inside?" "No." "Okay." He seemed to accept that completely and immediately, and he put the photograph back in his jacket and stood there in his good boots in the dirt, and he did not try again. "Then I'll say it out here." "Say it." "Your grandfather's patterns are drifting," he said. "The set on the floor. All of them." Zora did not move. "In July I pulled a stove off the line," Reyes said. "Then I bought a stove off a woman in the next county who's had hers since '98, paid her $900 for it, and I put them both on a table and measured them. Same model, same building, same everything." He held up 2 fingers a hair apart. "The door on the new one sits about 40 thousandths proud of where the old one sits. Do you know what 40 thousandths does over a season of heat cycles?" "It cracks the casting at the hinge, boss," Zora said. Reyes looked at her for a second, and something in his face changed, and it was the first honest thing he did. "Yeah," he said, "it does. So you know." "I know 100-and-some-year-old company was making a product to a tolerance that isn't written anywhere," Reyes said. "I know there's no drawing, there's no CAD, there's no spec sheet, there's no QC file. I've had 2 people looking for 3 months. There's a foundry down there with a name on the building and a 2-year backlog, and every single thing it knows how to do lives in a dead man's head." He stopped. Or it did. The wind came up through the clearing and went away again. "I'll be straight with you, because I don't think anything else works with you," Reyes said. "Your brothers didn't get $2.6 million. That number is what the press release said. They got 1.9 at closing, and 700,000 in a holdback that pays out over 3 winters if production stays inside spec. And it won't." "It won't," he agreed. "It's already outside. The fall pours are going to be bad and the winter pours are going to be worse, and by March, there's going to be a run of warranty claims that ends the brand." He said it like a man reading a weather report. "That's not a threat. I don't have any leverage here, and I know it. That's just what's going to happen." "Then why are you standing in my yard?" "Because I'd like to buy what's upstairs," Colin Reyes said. "All of it. The loft and the notebooks and everything on that bench. $400,000. Zora heard the number, and her ears did a strange thing, like going underwater. $400,000. She had $1,400 because the water pump had finally gone in June and taken 500 of it. No, she said. Reyes nodded slowly. He did not look surprised and he did not look defeated. He looked like a man who had budgeted for the first no. Think about it, he said. I'll come back. He came back on the 18th. There was no photograph this time. He brought a folder and he did not open it. And he stood in the same spot in the yard, which she noticed because it meant he had thought about where to stand. 800,000, he said. Zora put her hand on the porch rail. And a job, Reyes said. Head of pattern. You'd run it. We'd build you a shop at the works, real shop, dust collection, whatever you want. You'd hire your own people. He paused. Your name goes on it. Not the stove. I know the stove already has your name on it. And I want you to know I find that genuinely uncomfortable. I mean, your name goes on the department. It's yours. And you get the loft. And I get the loft. She stood there. Here is where I have to tell you what she actually did, instead of what she should have done, because this is a true thing about her, and she has never once tried to dress it up. She said yes. She said it out loud, standing on that porch at 4:40 in the afternoon on the 18th of August. One word. Okay. Just that. And Colin Reyes did not smile or shake her hand or produce a pen, because he was better at this than that. He just said, okay, I'll have papers Thursday, and got in his car and went carefully back down the mountain. And she meant it. That is the part nobody believes. She was not running a play. She was not buying time. Zora was 21 and broke, and both her parents were in the ground, and the man who raised her was in the ground, and her brothers had fired her by letter, and a decent, competent stranger had driven up a mountain twice to tell her that she mattered and hand her $800,000, and for about an hour it was the biggest relief she had ever felt in her life. She sat on the porch and let herself picture it, a real shop, dust collection, hiring Reuben back inside a month, and the melter, and the crane woman, fixing all of it, being the one who fixed all of it. Then the sun went down, and she went inside and lit number 4 and sat in front of it, and the small stove was on the bench where it had been all summer with no door on it, and she looked at that for 11 hours. She did not sleep. There were no tears in it either. She sat on a crate in a cold room with her hands hanging between her knees and looked at an unfinished thing, and she was not thinking anything noble, and there was no moment where she came to a decision. At about 4 in the morning, she got up and put her hand flat on the pattern, on the body of it, where the shellac was, and she left it there. The window went gray around 6. She drove down to the bottom of the ruts, which is where you get 1 bar, and she called him. It's Zora Kovac, she said. I'm not selling it. There was a pause on the line. In the pause, she could hear a hotel television. May I ask why? Reyes said. No, she said, which was the truth. She could not have told him. She sat in her truck at the bottom of a mountain road with the phone against her ear and could not have given that man one sentence that would hold water. Reuben asked her on Saturday. He asked her carefully, the way you carry a full cup. You want to tell me what happened? He offered me $800,000 and a shop, and I said yes, Zora said. And then I called him back at 6 in the morning and said no. Reuben absorbed that. Why'd you say yes? Because I wanted it. Why'd you say no? I don't know, she said. And Reuben, who had given that floor 3 decades and come up 3 months short, looked at her for a long moment and said, okay, and went and got his crossword. He never asked her again. That is one of maybe 4 reasons she loves him. Her brothers came on the last Saturday in August. They came together in Garrett's car, which made it up the ruts, because the crane woman had fixed the ruts, and Zora had a moment of genuine hilarity about that, standing on the porch, watching them arrive on a road her friends had built. Nolan got out first. He had lost weight. He looked at the cabin, at the new roof, at the 4 trucks in the yard, and he did not look at her. Garrett got out and put his sunglasses on his head and looked around at the whole thing for a good 10 seconds. Huh, he said. Reuben and the melter came out of the shop and stood on either side of the door, not doing anything, just standing, and Garrett clocked that and did not comment. Can we talk to you? Garrett said. Alone? No. Zora said, Zor, they can hear anything you want to say to me. Garrett breathed out through his nose. Fine, he said. Fine. The patterns are company property. They're not. They were made by an employee of the company, on company time, for company use for half a century, Garrett said. That's work for hire. That's not a close question. I've had 2 people look at it. He made them here, Zora said. On his time, on his land, with his wood. He made them for the works. He made them because nobody else would. Garrett's jaw went tight and he looked away, off into the trees, and when he looked back, something had come off his face, and what was underneath it was the first real thing he had said to her in a year. You want to do this? He said. Okay, let's do it. You want to know what I was doing while you 2 were up here whittling? Garrett, Nolan said. No, she's 21, she can hear it. He turned to Zora. In 2019, the works lost money. 2020, lost money. Do you know that? Did anybody up here tell you that between the crossword puzzles? Zora did not say anything. I begged that man to buy 1 machine, Garrett said. 1. A router that would have cut a pattern in 4 hours instead of 4 weeks. He wouldn't look at the brochure. He would not look at the brochure, Zora. And then he'd disappear every Saturday and come back Sunday night with sawdust on him and never say where he'd been. And I'd be at the kitchen table on Sunday night moving $40,000 around so 22 people could get paid on Friday. His voice did not rise. That was the worst part. I did that for 11 straight winters, Garrett said. Nobody ever came down to the office. You want to talk about who came down? Nobody came down to the office. You think he was a saint. He was a man who carved birds in a shack and left me holding the payroll. The clearing was very quiet. And here is the thing, and Zora knew it while he was saying it, and she has never stopped knowing it. He was not lying, not one word of that was a lie. You're right, she said. Garrett blinked. He should have told you. Zora said, he should have told you about all of it. He should have showed you this place in 2019 and put the books in your hands and said, here, this is what I've got, help me. And he didn't, because he was proud and he was scared, and he couldn't say a hard thing out loud to save his life. And that hurt you. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you it didn't. Garrett stared at her. And then he had a stroke, Zora said, and you took his signature. I saved that company. You sold that company. I saved it first, Garrett said, and his voice cracked on it, and that crack is the only apology she ever got from him, and she did not recognize it at the time. That was when Nolan said it. He had been standing by the car the whole time with his hands in his pockets, and when he spoke, everybody turned, because nobody had expected him to. You didn't stay for him. Nolan said, no, she's up here playing the good one. Nolan's face was red. You didn't stay for him, Zora. You stayed because you couldn't hack it out there. That letter came in August, and you were scared to death, and then he got sick and you got a reason. He gave you a reason not to go. Zora heard the whole clearing go still. Because she had thought it. That is the thing. She had thought that exact sentence, in those words, at 3 in the morning more times than she could count, and there is only one way Nolan could have known to reach for it, and it is that he is her brother. She let it sit there a second. Maybe, she said. Nolan's mouth opened. Maybe that's true, Zora said. I've thought about it. I'll probably think about it the rest of my life. She looked at him. You were up here, weren't you? Nolan's face did the thing faces do. You came up that ladder and took a picture of my grandfather's loft and sent it to a man from a private equity group, she said. When? July, Nolan said. His voice had gone small. Nolan, Garrett said, and it was clear from his face that he had not known that. He had not known. He turned and looked at his brother, and Zora watched the last good thing between the 2 of them fall out on the ground in front of everybody. You know what the difference is, Zora said. You keep waiting for me to make you the villain, and I'm not going to. I don't have the energy. I've got a stove with no door on it, and 51 notebooks I haven't finished reading. She came down 1 step off the porch. I'm not going to ruin you, she said. I'm just going to stop carrying you. The papers came 11 days later. Adele Nunez called her at the bottom of the ruts because that is where the phone works. And Zora sat in her truck with the door open and one boot in the dirt and listened to a small woman in a one-room office over a pharmacy explain how this was going to go. They filed, Adele said, declaratory judgment. They want a ruling that the pattern equipment is company property under work for hire, and there's a claim for conversion tacked on, which is nonsense, but it's there to scare you. Can they win? That's the wrong question, Adele said. Adele. No, listen to me, because this is the part that matters, and nobody ever believes it. There was a sound of a chair. I think you'd win. I think on the law you'd probably win. He bought that land in his own name. He built that shop with his own money. He never billed the company for 1 hour of it, and a judge with any sense would see it. Then it takes 24 months, Adele said, maybe 36, and it costs somewhere north of $100,000 because they'll depose everybody who ever set foot up there, and they'll paper you to death. And their firm bills that to a company and yours bills it to a girl with a milk crate. She let that sit. Zora, it does not matter whether you're right. It matters whether you can afford to be right. And you can't. They know you can't. That's what the filing is. Zora looked out the windshield at the trees. So what do I do? You settle, or you go find money, Adele said. Or you find something I don't have. Like what? Like anything in writing, Adele said. Anything at all. A letter, a note, a scrap. Did that man ever put a single thing down on paper about that property in his whole life? And Zora sat there in the truck with the door open, and something went through her from her scalp to her heels. Adele, she said. He wrote down the weather. She drove back up so fast she cracked the oil pan on a rock and did not stop. She went in and got on her knees at the shelf under the bench, the shelf she had sat next to for 4 months, and she started pulling the green ledgers out and stacking them on the floor. And she pulled all 51 of them, and behind them, pushed to the back against the wall where you would never see it unless you emptied the whole shelf, was a tin. It was a cookie tin. It was old, and it was rusted through in one corner, and there was a picture of a Scottish terrier on the lid. Zora sat down on the floor with it in her lap. She got her thumbnail under the edge, and she got it around, and the lid came off. On top there were letters, folded in thirds, maybe 30 of them, and every one was from Adele Nunez. Zora read them on the floor with the tin between her knees. They went back 7 summers. They were about selling the works to the people who worked in it. There were numbers in them, and payment schedules, and long, careful paragraphs about how 22 people who had never owned anything could buy a foundry on a note they could actually carry, and Adele had clearly told him a dozen times that this was going to be difficult. And he had clearly not cared. The last letter had a document behind it, stapled, 40 pages, and there was a line at the back for his signature. The line was blank. Zora sat there with her thumb on the blank line for a while. He had run out of the one thing he never thought about running out of. That is all that happened. There was no villain in that stack of paper. A stubborn old man had been slowly, badly, privately trying to give a foundry to the people standing in it, and he took too long, and then one afternoon in October his brain closed a door on him, and a month later his oldest grandson had power of attorney and killed it with one phone call. Underneath the letters was a single page from the county. It had a stamp on it. It had a recording number across the top in that ugly courthouse typeface, and a date, and the date was 5 summers old, and Zora knew that date because she had been staring at it in pencil on the bottom of a stove all summer. The same week, he had cut the first shaving of her stove, and then he had gotten in his truck and driven to the county seat. It was one paragraph. He had written it himself, and you could tell because it read like a man talking. It said that the building on the parcel was a pattern shop. It said that the shop contents, being the patterns, the tooling, the records, and the bench, were part of the property and not separable from it, and that they passed with the land to whoever took the land. Signed, witnessed, recorded. She got down the mountain to the 1 bar of service so fast she does not remember doing it. Adele Nunez did not say anything for about 11 seconds after Zora read it to her. Zora could hear her breathing. Read me the recording number, Adele said. Zora read it. Again. Okay, Adele said, and her voice had gone strange. Okay, Zora, I need you to sit down, because I want to explain what this is, and I want to do it slowly. Because I have been doing this in that county since before you were born, and this is the best thing I have ever held in my hand. I'm sitting. Your grandfather owned that company outright when he signed this. Adele said. All of it. There was no board. There were no partners. He was the works. She let that land, so if the works ever had any claim on those patterns, the man who was the works gave it up, in public. On the record, 5 summers before he died, and 3 summers before the stroke, so there's no capacity argument, there's no undue influence, there's nothing. Okay, that's the first thing, Adele said. Here's the second thing, and this is the one that's going to sit with you. Okay, the estate distribution, Adele said. The paper your brothers signed in April. Do you remember the language? Zora's mouth went dry. The 40 acres on Bittern Creek, she said. And everything standing on it. And everything standing on it. Adele said. That's the phrase. That's the phrase your grandfather wrote into the will when you were 10, and it is the exact phrase he used in the recording 5 summers ago, and it means what he says it means, because he recorded a document telling the entire world what it means. Zora put her hand over her eyes. Your brother signed that, Adele said. Garrett signed it. His signature is on page 4. He conveyed it to you himself at a table with cookies on it while he was laughing. He didn't know. No, Adele said. He didn't. And that's not my problem, and it isn't yours. There was a rustle of paper. Zora, this is a public record. It has been sitting in the recorder's office in plain sight since before you could legally drink. Anybody could have found it. Any first-year clerk with an afternoon could have found it. Your brother's lawyer never pulled the parcel file. Why not? Because the parcel was worth $11,000, Adele said, and it would have cost him $11, and he did not think it was worth $11. There was a long pause on the line. Adele, Zora said, what happens to the lawsuit? There isn't one, Adele said. Not after Monday. Their claim is that the company owns those patterns. I'm going to send them a page with a stamp on it that says the sole owner of that company put it in writing 5 summers ago, that it doesn't. She almost laughed. Zora, your brother isn't suing you. He's suing his grandfather. And his grandfather already answered. It ended on a Monday, on the telephone, in about 4 minutes. Adele called their firm and read a recording number out loud to a paralegal, and 11 days later a piece of paper came saying the matter was dismissed, and that was the whole climax of it. Nobody stood up in a courtroom. Nobody made a speech. There is no scene here of Garrett's face going white, because Zora was not in the room, and she has thought since that this is probably better. She was up the mountain with a chisel in her hand when it happened. Reuben told her. He came in with his phone and said, Adele says it's over, and Zora said, okay, and kept working, and about 4 minutes later she had to put the chisel down and go stand outside. It was out there, in the yard, that she understood about the word. She had been carrying it for a year and a half, and it had never once come apart for her, and it came apart standing in the dirt with her hands on her hips looking at nothing. He had one word. Think about what that means. He was lying in a bed with a mountain in his head. There was a loft full of shapes, and 51 green books, and a page at the courthouse, and a stove for her with no door on it. And all of that was up a road that only 2 living people had ever driven, and he could not say cabin, and he could not say Bittern, and he could not say Zora. Go up there and look. What he could say was door. So he said it to the nurse, and he said it to the ceiling, and he said it to her while she cut his food up, and every single time he said it, he was trying to hand her a mountain with the only sound he had left. And every time he said it, Garrett went in and closed the door. Zora stood in that yard for a long time. The rest of it happened the way arithmetic happens. The fall pours came out bad. Winter was worse. The holdback died on a spreadsheet in a city Zora has never been to, and the buyer walked away in February and left the works dark with a 2-year list of people still waiting in a spiral notebook. Garrett got $1.9 million, minus what he owed his lawyers, and a house he had already sold, and a name on a building nobody was allowed to use anymore. Nobody up the mountain celebrated. Zora would like that on the record. There was a Saturday in February when the melter said something about it, and Reuben told him to shut up. And he shut up, and that was the end of the discussion. Nolan came in March. He came on foot. His truck could not make the ruts, or he did not try, and Zora looked out the window, and there was her brother walking up the last 100 yards of a mountain road in his work coat with his hands in his pockets. She met him in the yard. She did not invite him in. "I took the picture," he said. "I know. I want to say it out loud, though." He was looking somewhere over her shoulder. "I came up here in July." Garrett didn't know. Reyes was in town asking questions, and I remembered there was a bunch of old wooden stuff at the shack from when I was a kid. And I thought... He stopped. I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe I'd be the one who... He did not finish it. He never finished any of them that day. "Okay," Zora said. "That's it? What do you want me to say, Nolan?" He stood there in the yard with the snow going gray around the edges of the clearing, and he did not have an answer. And Zora watched her brother be 28 and out of ideas. "There's 400 pounds of sand in the back of Reuben's truck," she said finally. "It's got to come inside before it gets wet." Nolan looked at her. "That's not forgiveness," she said. "Don't take it as forgiveness. It's sand and it's got to come in." He carried sand until dark. He came back the next Saturday and carried more. Most Saturdays since, he has been up there, and he and Zora do not talk about April, and they may never talk about April, and Reuben says that is not the same thing as being broken. Garrett came once. That was in April, a year after the table with the cookies on it. Zora heard the car and came to the door, and he was standing in the yard, and he did not come up on the porch. The two of them looked at each other across about 30 feet of mud. He did not apologize. He has never apologized. Zora has made her peace with the fact that he is probably never going to, because the apology would require him to hold two true things at once, that he was wronged and that he did wrong. And Garrett has only ever been able to carry one thing at a time. What he did was walk to the porch rail and put something on it, folded. Then he got in his car and left. It was the apron. Canvas, brown, stiff as a shingle, with the burn scar across the belly from something that happened before any of them were born. He had kept it in his trunk for a year. Zora hung it on the nail by the door, and it is there now. And she does not wear it, because it is not hers. It is just there, the way a thing can be there. 11 months after the tin came off that shelf, there was a shop on the mountain. It is not a factory. Nobody should tell you it is a factory. It is a pole barn 40 feet behind the cabin with a small cupola and a sand floor and a good roof, and it holds 6 people if 2 of them are willing to stand close. They pour 6 stoves a month. 6. On a good month, 7. Reuben is the foreman, which he says is a made-up job, and he is right, and he does it anyway. The melter melts. The crane woman does not run a crane, because there is no crane, so she does the books, which it turns out she is much better at. Zora could not fix Reuben's pension. She has been clear about this every time somebody tries to make the story tidier than it is. 3 decades on that sand floor, 3 months short, and it is gone. And no amount of anything up a mountain brings it back. What she could do was the other thing. So she did the other thing. She took her grandfather's 40 pages out of the tin, and she gave them to Adele. And she said, "Make this smaller. Make it small enough to work." And what came out the other end was 6 pages instead of 40. And it says that the shop belongs to the hands that are on it, and that when you have been there a year, you own a piece of it, and that nobody can sell it out from under anybody. Ever. Because it is not the kind of thing you are allowed to sell. Emil Kovac spent his whole life making things that outlast the people who buy them. It took his granddaughter until she was 22 to finish the one thing he had made that was supposed to outlast him. They were back-ordered before the first pour. That is not a figure of speech. The list started coming back on its own because the woman in shipping had kept the spiral notebook when the works went dark. And one Saturday in May, she drove up the mountain and handed it to Zora in the yard and said, "This isn't theirs. It was never theirs." Marisol came up in June, walking, angry. She was 16 and her mother had run the core room since Marisol was in grade school and had been out of work since February. And she came up that road on foot, carrying a cracked stove door and a garbage bag, because there was nobody in town who would fix it anymore. "They said you're the one now," Marisol said. She said it like an accusation. "Who said?" "Everybody." Zora looked at her for a second. She looked at a furious 16-year-old girl standing in a yard with a broken piece of iron in a garbage bag and nowhere else on earth to be, and she recognized her so completely that it was almost funny. "Come inside," Zora said. "It's cold and I'm not doing this in the yard. Marisol comes up most days now. Zora has never once asked her to. The door took her the better part of a year. She started it in the fall, and she was still at it in the spring. And she ruined 2 of them. And the second one she ruined, she threw across the shop hard enough to take a chip out of the wall, and Reuben picked it up and put it in the stove, and said nothing at all. 'It won't come,' she told him once. 'I can carve anything.' I carved the whole rest of it in my head 6 times. 'It won't come.' 'A door's the hardest part,' Reuben said. 'That's why he left it for you.' She got it in April. What was different about the third one, she could not tell you. She has tried. The gouge went where she pushed it, and the shaving came off in one curl and dropped on her boot. And about 4 hours later, there was a door sitting on the bench that had never existed before, and it fit the frame he cut 5 summers ago, like the 2 of them had been made in the same week by the same hand, which, in a way that Zora is still working out, they were. They poured it on a Tuesday. Reuben rammed the sand himself and would not let anybody else touch it. It is the smallest stove anybody has ever made on that mountain. It would not heat a house. What it heats is one room, one small room, one room about the size of the room it is standing in, which is the room it was cut for. They still tell it the old way in town. They still say Emil Kovac went up that mountain every weekend for 50 years to fish. People say it in the diner, to strangers, with total confidence. And Zora lets them because it is a good story and it costs nothing, and the man is not here to argue. But on cold nights, there is a stove burning in a cabin on 40 acres of rock the county says is worth $11,000. It is the only one they have ever made that is not for sale. It sits in the one room it was always meant for, with a door somebody finished late. Zora lights it, and it draws clean, and the room goes warm, and she sits down in front of it with her hands open on her knees. That is all he ever wanted her to have. It took her a while to get up the road, but she got there, and she was the only one who came.